Welcome to SciTech Culture with Steve Kern and Ben Warner, where we examine science, technology and culture in the 21st century. Visit our website at scitechculture.com. Hello and welcome to SciTech Culture. My name is Ben Warner and I'm joined once again by my good friend and colleague Steve Kern. How are we today, Steve? We're Zooming today and it seems to be working pretty well after an upgrade or two.
Oh yes, of course in the last 3 months Zoom has gone from strength to strength and wow, it's a different beast now to what it was.
Yeah, you're certainly coming through loud and clear and very smooth there.
Sounding very well done, Zoom.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we're going to touch on the pandemic and the coronavirus again today. We're going to start with just the latest in America, where they were hitting some highs in the last couple of days, including 55,000 cases a day. Seems to be going in different states now. So I believe it was Florida that was leading the pack with about 10,000 or so a day from what we can see. And it kind of highlights just, I guess, the way it's sort of playing out over in the States is quite different in a way to quite a lot of other countries, only in the sense that they, who knows what it is, but, you know, they seem to be on a trajectory to slow things down, and now it's just sort of sped up again. And it might be because of early easing of restrictions, or who knows what it is, but they're really skyrocketing now.
Well, I think you have to remember that they're a large country spread across a huge continent. And, you know, we know that the patterns of infection are never uniform. You know, they start at the ports where people enter, so your busiest ports, which are the east and west coast. And I guess it works its way into the middle somehow through transmission. And I think that's why we've seen it sort of pop up state by state almost. And, yeah, you could talk about the way it's been managed over there. And without being able to do it uniformly, it's very hard to get a uniform result. So, yes, it's certainly serious over there. But, you know, I guess the brighter side of it is I guess with it going through America like this, they'll have some sort of herd immunity at this rate.
Well, it's interesting just touching on that, is that was like the option that no one's wanting to go down because it could yield in potentially, you know, a lot of people dying from it. But it's a bit hard to see them not almost getting to that point, because it just seems to be like there's just so many of them. I mean, obviously it's however many, I can't recall the latest numbers. I mean, obviously it's still a fraction of the population still that's infected, but at the rate they're going, you know, over the next 6 months or something, if they can't turn it around, they could get to that sort of inadvertently.
Well, that's right. And Sweden's the one country which has given it a go, and, you know, they've got the highest death rate in Europe. But I think, you know, their strategy was to give people the choice to distance and to protect themselves, and to ensure that the health system wasn't overwhelmed, so that those that caught it could be treated. Now, I think there can be a huge debate, which is certainly out of my understanding or expertise, around whether that's the right way to go or not. But by the end of this, I guess theoretically at least, Sweden will be able to open up. They'll have herd immunity. And coronavirus has been shown that if you have it, you build your antibodies and it protects you against the virus. So whereas in Australia, I mean, potentially we have to stay locked up until everybody's vaccinated.
That's probably a good segue across into what's happening in Australia at the moment by comparison, considering some of the reactions in Victoria at the moment, with an increase in cases after a plateau for a while. But putting it into context that, you know, America, again, 55,000 cases in one day, and we're talking about, you know, 108 being the highest in the last couple of months, just recorded yesterday, just in the state. So I guess, you know, it's not the comparison there is pretty obvious in that, you know, it's quite different. But having said that, you know, we'll go into the detail of this in a minute. They're taking it very seriously from all accounts, based on the reaction so far.
Well, I can imagine why, but I think there are two things that, you know, and I guess the problem with any response to a pandemic, and this instance in particular, you have to choose a strategy and then you have to go with that strategy. You can't sort of sit in the middle. But I think there's two things, that Australia can consider out of this is one, that we generally have a very low infection rate anyway, and our health system is not overwhelmed by this by any stretch of the imagination. We've got plenty of beds if we need them. And I think consequently, that's why we have one of the lowest death rates in the world. So I think we're, well ahead on that score. So potentially we could accept a greater amount of infection without it necessarily being high risk. But how do you draw the line?
Do you reckon that's a question of just good fortune in that, we've seen cases, looking at it from a percentage basis, deaths per contraction of the virus in terms of numbers, is that there's high death rates in different countries. So we've, for whatever reason, had a much lower rate, and that's the reason why it hasn't overwhelmed the system where it has overwhelmed it elsewhere.
Well, I think we've had a combination of luck and excellent management, of the strategy. So if you think about it, we closed our borders at the right time. If we'd left them open for even 3 or 4 days longer, we'd see a much greater sort of case rate. And then, even though everyone seems to be having a bit of a poke at Victoria now, I think overall as a country, we've managed the situation according to the strategy, which is to try and suppress the outbreak. We've done that very effectively in this country. As I say, that now leads to the question of, we're welcome to go overseas, but I don't think anyone would be welcome to come back. So, that's a bit of a problem, unless you want to take an extended holiday. Maybe it's the time to take your gap year now.
Well, I guess they're still talking about that trans-Tasman bubble as being one of the only viable options at the moment.
Yeah. For Australia and New Zealand, it is the only option because really you can't let anyone in, not unless they're willing to undergo a couple of weeks quarantine and testing. So it's tricky.
Well, that's the interesting thing. And excuse me, the Victoria, well, let's hope not. The Victorian response so far in the last week or two, and the fact that they've, the details are a bit sketchy because I haven't gone into too much detail, but it seems to have started with just 2 or 3 people that then led to a cascade, which is the type of scenario that they're obviously wanting to avoid in terms of it's spreading out, etc. But the interesting thing being that they, progressed to the lockdown of specific suburbs, postcodes, and now it is extended to the hard lockdown of 9 public housing buildings with police basically preventing people from leaving the building for 5 days. And obviously there's a whole lot of commentary around that and how people are responding to that, particularly as there's been some criticism of the state government here that perhaps it was the lax hotel quarantine procedures that led to this, spike, for lack of a better word, that's happening right now.
Yeah, it's hard to take a position on this because there is a strategy in place in Australia which is to eradicate or attempt to suppress the any outbreak, and by and large, the public is doing the right things. Look at the number of people that have gone and got tested in Melbourne in the last couple of weeks. So it doesn't matter. You're always going to have 10%, 15% of the population that won't get tested, refuses to get tested, that'll run around and maybe even spread it inadvertently, probably not deliberately. And I think we have to live with that. And then, you can go into the argument about like the lockdown. We've got 100 cases. It's not out of control, but it could get out of control. It's a very complicated issue. I mean, to that end, that's where America's simplified simply by just getting on with it. And, they locked themselves down for 6 weeks. That was 5 weeks too long for them. And, now they're out there with masks on, just getting on with it. And you can argue as much as you like about whether that's right or wrong, and everyone will have an opinion on that. But I guess you see that probably in a year's time, we'll be able to look back and hopefully have a better idea of what the right strategy is for an infection like COVID, because this would be very different if it was, something far more lethal like SARS.
Well, yeah, and I guess the trickiest thing about it was just the fact that in so many cases, like, people won't even know that they've got it, that's the tricky thing. I mean, the interesting thing, obviously, with the in the States is that some of those states are heading back into lockdowns again as well, which seems to be more of a reactionary approach, I guess, more than anything else. I guess here they're going with the abundance of caution, which hence tends to be the sort of strong sort of actions that are being taken. And it was good to see at least some commentary, I think nationally, just telling states to not go so hard on each other. There was that article in the ABC where, there's no point in like ostracizing Victorians because, this has happened. Yet that seems to be, in some cases, some of the rhetoric coming out from some leaders, etc.
This isn't a football game, and it sits beyond politics. So, and everyone's trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, so it's interesting to see that kind of dynamic play out. One random thing that I did want to throw in here, though, that I'll just spring on you now, though, was, and this is more, I guess, more out of amusement more than anything else, was that I noticed that they were relocating some AFL clubs to the Gold Coast and I think Sydney as well, although I can't remember. I didn't follow it exactly. I just sort of caught it off the side, and I thought that was their measure to solve the issue of the season continuing. But what happens if there's an outbreak in those places? What are they going to pull up and move somewhere else again?
They're going to run out of places to go. But what I suspect will happen out of that is they'll send off the Victorian clubs as early as possible, and then do the last part of the season will all be in Melbourne, which makes sense. Yeah. I think so, but it doesn't solve anything. I think there should actually be exemptions for professional sports people, because typically, even in a normal season, they're partially quarantined anyway, just to keep fit and stay away from the flu and all those sorts of things. So they've got good medical supervision. Under COVID, I know the AFL players are being tested twice a week.
Yeah.
I just think that, they're not your standard interstate travellers, are they?
No, but I guess they would have to have had some pretty solid processes put in place if they were going to satisfy, what was going on in terms of all this.
This is where I think that it gets a bit tricky, because, certainly the rhetoric in some of the states has been no exemptions. No, everyone's equal. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, you can say that, but, I think, the AFL certainly, because that is truly national competition, are very well documented, and very, they're doing the right things. And so I think on those grounds, it's you could grant them an exemption quite easily. They've got the evidence that they're testing. They've got the procedures in place, and I'm no fan of the AFL myself, administration. But you got to be fair. They're doing the right things. And I think this posturing at a state level that everyone should be treated the same is just ridiculous. They're not the same, they're not doing the same as the general public. They're being tested twice a week.
And I guess just to just bring it back to the Victorian government response, the other thing that I thought was interesting was this sort of flip-flopping on commentary, reaction, and criticism, because at first it's like the Victorians are going in hard and taking the strongest measures, and pat on the back to the Premier and all of that, and now that this increase in numbers has occurred, all of a sudden the knives are out already, and looking for people to blame as to who stuffed up what, and it's not helpful at any rate, because like you said, it's a complicated issue to manage.
Yeah, well, it's just, once again, this to me is really what social media achieves. Set up two sides and let them just slag each other off. And, that's why I've got very little interest in that. I remember a time once when Australia was all about Australians, whatever state they came from. Sure, you had a few, rivalries across borders, but, I think when it comes to times such as these, you'd like to see a nation stand together, and you can see in cases where that doesn't happen, and I think we can see it in the States right now, it's not a good look.
No.
It's not a good look. We should be working together to solve this, not taking cheap shots.
Absolutely. All right, we might wrap it up there. Well, the last thing would just be to mention that the building lockdowns are only 5 days long. So this time next week, we'll be able to see what the results are and provide our own commentary accordingly.
Well, that's right. I hope it goes well. And I guess we've set our course back in March of what we wanted to do as a nation with suppressing COVID. Let's hope we're successful.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so don't forget our website, scitechculture.com. You can get all of our links and content there. You can subscribe to our YouTube and Vimeo channels, our RSS feeds, and watch us on any and all of your devices, and we greatly appreciate your visit to our website. All right, so that's it for this episode. We'll catch you next time.